Just a couple of notes. When we first put down the titles for these things, God accompanies us, grace accompanies us, I had no idea whether this would work or not. So for me, it's been quite an exploration of reading through Pope Francis's reflections and seeing if there was some material in there that would be helpful for us. And before we let go of our gathering last month, when we talked about grace accompanying everyone, and we explored that subtle and challenging area of shame and how the Lord comes to enter into our shame and to clothe us with his glory, I just wanted to come back to two little scenes. And you have them in your mind. You've pictured them many times, but they're worth revisiting. The first scene is the story of Zacchaeus, which we talked about a little bit. Picture that scene in your mind. Jesus is coming into the village. Zacchaeus wants to see him, climbs up into the tree. Jesus has this encounter with Zacchaeus. Now, in your mind's eye, and I don't think these are accidents either, is Jesus looking down on Zacchaeus or up at Zacchaeus? Up at Zacchaeus. I don't think that's an accident. The second scene that we have, and one it slides by equally quickly, is the woman that's brought to Jesus who is caught in sin, and they want him to condemn her. And he writes on the ground, is he looking down on the woman or up at the woman? Up at the woman. I don't think those are accidents. I think when we heard at the very beginning of our journey about how Jesus humbled himself to come among us and then became humbler yet, even to accepting death on a cross, this is not just somehow Jesus used to be in heaven and now he's on earth. This is a spiritual relationship, an emotional relationship. When Jesus approaches us, he always approaches us from below. He never approaches us looking down on us. And I think that's such a good thing for us to understand and embrace. He always is looking up at us. He always insists on being the vulnerable one, the at-risk one. Never, ever the superior one. Never, ever looking down on us. So before we let go of Zacchaeus and that journey, I just wanted to plant those two ideas in your minds. And then before we have a look at this complicated, and I apologize for how complicated it got, but that's your homework, so you can handle this. I just wanted to reread that wonderful statement that we've been reflecting on since we began that journey from Pope Francis about the art of accompaniment, in particular to read the second part of this. The pace of the accompaniment must be steady and reassuring, reflecting our closeness and our compassionate gaze, which also heals, liberates, and encourages growth. The pace is steady and reassuring. Because the thing we wanted to have a look at today was, and I think you've had this experience in your own life, you're caught in a family argument, or if you're discussing something with a neighbor, you find yourself caught between the church's teaching and the lived life of somebody in front of you. Somebody's divorced and they're saying something about the church, or somebody is not practicing and they're angry about the church, or someone has a different sexual orientation, and you're kind of, and I think we find ourselves caught in the middle. Is that an experience that is in your wheelhouse? You've been there, you know what that's like. Does Pope Francis have anything to say about that? Because it's nice to think about accompaniment as journeying with people who are sick, who are weak, who are frail. But what happens when we're accompanying somebody who's angry, who's mad at the church, or mad at you because you represent the church? What happens when we're caught in that situation? Does Pope Francis have anything to say about that? Because I think that's one of our difficult and burdensome experiences on the Christian life. And I think one of the things that he recognizes, and I have a few notes in there, is he says, the world that's presented to us in Hallmark Christmas cards, it doesn't exist. And he's so right, but it's so refreshing to hear it from the leader of the church. Perfect families don't exist, he says. Perfect marriages don't exist, he says. And I think it's wonderful to hear the Pope say that. You know that. Well, at least you look at your own life and say, well, mine isn't perfect. Maybe Pete and Susan is, but mine isn't. So it's so refreshing, I think, to hear the Pope say that. And then he paints a picture, and Pope Francis, he has been in the streets. So when he paints a picture, the picture's pretty accurate. So he points out that we're living in this very complex time. He says it's multicultural. We have so many different communities that are speaking to us today with different opinions about everything. He said we have young people growing up who are less formed in their faith than we were when we were being brought up. He notes that they have so many conditions that affect families that at one time, if you looked at a bar graph and said, which are the influences on children? In 1950, the church would have been up here, and then the family would have been here, and then the schools would have been here, and then the media would have been here. That's 1950. Well, guess what? Today, the media is here, social messaging is here, the church is here, the family is here. He said, that's a reality. That's what's happening to young people today. That's how they're being influenced and how they're being shaped. Isn't it refreshing to hear the Pope say that? No? Instead of feeling that, I have conversations with so many people who feel that they have failed because their children are not practicing, or this is not happening, or what did I do wrong in my life? Nothing. Pope Francis understands your dilemma. He's got a good eye and a keen sense of what these people are facing. He's noted that religion, which used to be a communitarian experience, something we shared with our neighbor, if you looked out on Sunday morning, everybody was going to some church. Religion has now become private. If you have a faith, keep it to yourself. Don't talk about it. We're not interested in that. That has a big impact on how people's lives unfold. We're growing up in a culture now that's very democratic. The majority say that we all should do this. And then we bring that democratic mentality into the church and say, well, we all decided we're going to vote against confession. We thought that would be a good idea. Well, but that's what's happened. That democratic movement colors our young people, colors ourselves too when we think about what should be going on in the church. He notes that there are new strident voices addressing gender issues in the church today. Very loud gender voices on all sides. If you looked at the percentage of the population, say if percentage of the population that's gay might be 20%, occupies 70% of the news stories. You know, it's wonderful to be gay, I think that's great, but don't chew up all the oxygen in the room. You let the rest of us breathe once in a while, because, you know, we have concerns and issues as well. So I think, but what happens with that is it's so loud, it's so strident, you think that's the only thing going on today. And then we have all of the non-nons. Every new survey comes out, and there was one recently that announced that Lethbridge is no longer a Christian city. I don't know if you caught that survey. The majority of people in Lethbridge now, 51%, identify themselves as not Christian. Now, but we're hearing that all the time. What do you believe? I don't believe in anything. I'm going to tick off I don't believe, or I'm non-practicing or whatever. And it seems like that group is a huge, strong, united group of people who have one thing in common, and that is they don't believe. But when you have conversations with them, it turns out, well, I believe some things. It's interesting that many of the people who say they don't have any faith or they're atheistic, they actually believe in God. They just don't know they didn't know what the difference between agnostic and atheistic is. Many of them actually offer prayers too in times of crisis. Many of the people who are nones, they actually have quite a strong and healthy community service life. I'm going to volunteer, I'm going to be of service, I'm going to donate money to charity, that I can have a moral life without necessarily having a religious life. And they've carved that out. So this is the world in which we're trying to navigate and trying to find our path today. And one of the things that Pope Francis has pointed out is what's going on in this population that doesn't have any faith. And what he's noted in this is that they're very attracted to the idea that nobody is telling me what to do. That's one of the big attractors, is they resist anybody who says, you ought, you should. That voice, no matter what follows after the 3 dots, is irrelevant. We recoil against voices that say you should. There's a movement in our culture that says, don't tell me what I should. It doesn't matter what you're going to tell me, even if it's going to eat beans, I don't care. I just don't like anybody telling me what to do. That movement is in the culture today. So that kind of pushes back against the church's power to end up having a voice, having something to say to people. And then he talks about families, couples who are in irregular marriages. And he said, this is another area where it's not as if there's one model here. He said, we have couples who are in a irregular marriage, and for whatever reason, at the time they were getting married, a wedding in the church was not an easy option for them, so they pursued another course, and now they don't know how to fix it. We have that population. We have another population of people who got married and divorced, and for whatever reason now we can't even determine the circumstances of that first marriage, so we can't, in a sense, heal it. So we have that difficulty. We have couples who got married at a point in their life when they were not perhaps as mature as they might have been, so they made a life choice that turned out to be not a very healthy one. It didn't work out, and now they've got a good relationship, but we're burdened by the fact that we made this first decision, and now it's going to color what we're doing. So we have that package as well. So we have all of these cultural voices that are swirling around, coloring people's expectations, their values, their sense of what's going on in the church. And in the middle of it all, we've got families trying to raise kids, trying to bring up kids. No wonder we have some difficulties. No wonder we have some problems. The wonderful thing is Pope Francis senses this. He knows this because he's lived it in South America. He's lived it on the streets. He's aware of those realities, and he wants those realities to have an impact, to be present in the church's deliberations. So I think it's really good to have all of those things in the back of your mind. The other thing that he's commented on, he said, we have some wonderful failed attempts at responding to these dilemmas. So some of these are, they should be old, but they're not. So I was looking up some of this. So in 1906, Pope Pius wrote a letter to the French church. And in the letter, he describes the church, and this is 1906, not that long ago. He says, the church is made up of unequal communities. He said, there are the bishops and the clerics, and then there are the lay people, and these two communities are not equal. This is his language. He said, basically, it is the role of the bishops and the priests to be the people who tell what we're supposed to do, and it is the role of the lay people to be the sheep. Well, if you said that today, you'd probably get shot. But 1906 is not that far away. That's not so distant. And some of that teaching is still flowing around in our dear Catholic Church, that if you're a lay person, you're supposed to be the sheep, and if I'm a cleric or a bishop, I'm supposed to be the leader, and I'll do the leading and you do the following, and let's not get our parts mixed up here. One of the other wonderful images that Pope Francis has that's causing us problems is, he says, the Tower of Babel problem. Remember that story from the Old Testament? All these people, they filled with egos, and they were going to build this tower up to God, and they were going to make their own way to heaven on their own resources, and then God confounded them by giving them different languages. Pope Francis says the real problem there was people said, I know what Jim is thinking even before Jim says what he's thinking. And I've already prepared my response for why he's wrong. He said, that's the Babel problem. He says, we think we know what people are saying or believing or thinking before they even get the words out of their mouth. And we've already formed our response to that. That's the Tower of Babel problem from Pope Francis's point of view. The other problem that he's identified, and it's a problem that should not be here, but it's still here, and that was prior to the Second Vatican Council, the Church's vision was we were a city behind high walls. We were a little community, and there were big walls around us, and we had to defend the fort. That's how the Church modeled herself. And we're here to defend the Church against all of these other influences out there that are threatening to come in and attack us. The Second Vatican Council was quite amazing. So Gaudium and Spes, which is one of the big documents at the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium and Spes was very clear about saying God is speaking and engaged in a dialogue with us. And as a result of this, we have an intuitive ability to know the divine ourselves. You have an intuitive ability to know the divine. They called it sensum fidei, the sense of the faithful. There's a wonderful example of this in our church history. And so in 335, one of the councils, we've been through, the apostles are dead, but the church is meeting, and one of the issues they're debating is the role of Mary. So they're meeting in Ephesus. The new bishops are coming for this meeting. You can imagine 300, there's dust in the streets, there's people gathered around, and they know the bishops are meeting, and they know they're going to discuss this. And the lay people are outside saying, Mary, Mother of God, Mary, Mother of God, Mary, Mother of God, to the bishops. Basically saying to the bishops, get it right. We know she's the Mother of God. What's your problem? And finally, the bishops go in and have the meeting. They come out and say, we've decided that Mary is the Mother of God. But it's a wonderful historical memory of how the lay people know it. First, they already know. They knew that Mary was the Mother of God. The bishops were having a problem because they knew Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is the Son of God. They just had a real problem with saying Mary is the Mother of God. But finally, the lay people convinced the bishops Mary is the Mother of God. So what the church said at Gaudium Sped is the church has this instinct, and as a result, we now have the ability to understand more penetratingly, to express our faith more fully. And this was an interesting phrase, to adjust it more successfully. To adjust our faith more successfully to the times. Wonderful declaration of our church 60 years ago. Have you seen much evidence of that lately? No. And one of the reasons for that is that old 1906 model, I think it's still there, that we have it, the bishops, and you don't, the lay people, and our job is to tell it to you. In fact, it got so bad that our church began to think that the Pope has it, and don't be bothering the Pope with these ideas. So none of this came out until Pope Francis refreshingly began to tell the stories of what was going on in the Vatican. So in 2014, at one of the gatherings of the church, and he's speaking to the bishops at the Synod on the Family, and he says to the bishops, he said, now bishops, when you come here, you are representing particular churches. And a particular church possesses truth. Your particular church, whether it's in Togoland or wherever, it possesses truth. And you should bring your concerns and your problems and your insights and feel free to speak openly here. What was happening is when the bishops arrived in Rome and got into their little apartment, the major domos, the factotums in Rome, would say to them, now, Your Excellency, the Holy Father doesn't want to hear about this married priest business. Don't bring it up. And the bishop said, okay, if he doesn't want to hear about it, we won't talk about it. Well, that had been going on for years. They would come to Rome to have this synod on the family, or the synod on the Amazon, or the synod on youth, and when they walked in the door, they'd be getting, not, the Pope never told them, but he made it sure that the boys down the ladder got the message, and they told the bishops, the Holy Father does not want to hear about this. Don't bring it up. Well, Pope Francis has a very refreshing manner in all of this. So when he was speaking to the bishops at 2014, he said, this is going to stop. I want to hear the truth. I want to hear what you are really thinking. And he said, you give voice to synodality, to bring here the realities and problems. This is a great responsibility, he says, so that we can walk the path of the gospel together. And over and over again, he has made mention of this in something he calls speaking parousia. Now, it's a Greek word, but basically what parousia means is to tell what's on your mind and heart without rhetoric, without a lot of adjectives saying, even a fool knows that marriage is indissoluble. That's rhetoric. If you believe marriage is indissoluble, say marriage is indissoluble. You don't have to add the rhetoric back. Lose that bit. He said, parousia means you're going to speak the truth in your heart. And he said, even if you know it's going to offend people in this gathering, even if you know it might cost you something, he said, I want you to speak with parousia. And he said, and we have to listen with an open mind when someone is speaking with parousia, with that voice. And he's made reference to this over and over again in his address to the bishops, to the cardinals, to that whole world. We need to hear the truth. What are you really thinking?
Father Tim, can I ask a question? Can you clarify what you mean when you said it's okay to be gay?
Oh, I don't disagree that individuals are gay.
Okay.
That's fine enough. That's fine enough. All I was talking about was the strident voices that say, what was the question? Well, we're just asking about it's okay to be gay. I'm saying I don't have a problem with that at all. No. What I was saying is it's a smaller portion of the public and it occupies a lot of media. That's all. That's what I mean by the strident voices.
Is it okay to practice homosexual sex, though? Is that what you're saying?
We can talk about that, and we will talk a little bit about that if you'd like to.
Okay.
Do you want to try and get into that today, or do you want to save that?
Well, I just wonder if, like, you said to be open and ask the questions, so I'm just...
Is it okay to express sexually a homosexual relationship?
Well, does the church teach, I guess it's okay in the world, but are you saying that the church is saying that it's okay for us to support, how do I ask? like, we're supposed to love and, of course, embrace all people. But are we saying that sex outside of marriage is okay? Like, is that what you're saying?
No. I think what Pope Francis is saying, and I'm trying to reflect him, not me, and we're going to get into this when we talk about conscience.
Okay.
So do you want to wait a little bit about that? Because I think that might be helpful.
Okay.
He has some very, yeah, hang on to the thought. We can come back to that.
Okay.
I promise, I won't.
Okay.
I won't run and hide. Okay.
Just to,
So back to preach, he said, to speak with frankness, freedom, a risk to life and duty, speaking out of a sense that I feel obliged to say what's on my mind because I think it is for the good of the church. So all of that was part of Pope Francis's encouragement to his bishops and to his cardinals. The other thing that he introduced, and it was a reminder to us, is he pointed out that we have something in the Catholic Church called immutability. Immutability means that Jim throws a rock through a window, he's responsible for his actions. That's what immutability means. Now, the Catholic Church has always taught that there's a lot of circumstances that can color responsibility. Now, you might not often hear about them mentioned in church, but the Catholic Church officially teaches that there's a lot of factors that could color our sense of responsibility. Immaturity can do it. Addictions can do it. Someone could not understand the consequences of their actions. They can do it. So the Catholic Church has lots of official recognitions of the fact that immutability is conditional. It's not an absolute declaration. So he wants us to make sure we have that in the back of our mind. And then the other thing that he talked about in here, he talked about the principle of gradualness. And he actually made reference to other popes who've also mentioned this principle, but have not brought it up and have not stressed it as much. So the principle of gradualness basically means that all of us are on the way to living the Christian life. And we may not get it right the first time. We may not be able to express it perfectly at the beginning. So Pope Francis, one of his lines is, no one can be condemned forever. I love that line. No one can be condemned forever. But he said, the goal is, how do we walk with someone as they're trying to make progress in the Christian life? Now, he said, there's voices over here that will say, change the law, and maybe, Joanne, this is helpful, on many issues. You got to change the law, something wrong with the church's teaching. And there's voices over here that say, don't you dare change one drop of the law, or we're going down. Pope Francis said, this is not about changing the law or not changing the law. This is about accompanying people on their sincere journey to do what is right. And he said, that means you can leave the law there as a teaching tool. It still says this. But at the present moment, this individual, this is the best they can do in the situation in which they find themselves. Is that a little bit more helpful? So the church's teaching is still here as a guide, as the truth. But the recognition that in this person's life, at this point, this is the best they can do. And what's revolutionary about what he did is he began to reopen the area of conscience for us. Conscience, this place in our hearts where we, in conversation with God, make choices for our life, our conscience. Now, the way the church has handled conscience in the past tended to be like that 1906 model. We're the church, we know the truth, we're going to tell you the truth. Your role as conscience is to look at your life and say, oh, I missed here, and I missed over there, and I missed over there, and therefore I'm going to go to confession because I was wrong there, and there, because the church told me that, right? Pope Francis says, no. He says, we have to give the conscience more of its true potential. And the conscience also possesses the power to determine what is right for me in this situation. Our conscience has a right to determine what is right for me in this situation, as long as I understand I'm a work in progress. This is not the final version of me. I'm a work in progress. I'm in process. Today, at this point in my life, this is right for me. And so the church he presented a model that said, you accompany them, make sure you get to know them, discuss their circumstances, what's going on in their life, and then you discern with them what's going on, what's the decision that you're facing, what's the choices that you're going to make, what choice have you made, and then there's integration. How am I going to put that into my life? And then he says, and then you start over again. Accompany them, discern with them, integrate with them. So what Pope Francis, he has a big thing about saying time is more important than space. What does he mean by that? Space says, let's look at the pieces on the chessboard and let's decide you're there and we're going to give that a weighting of 2 and you're there and it's frozen. Pope Francis said, no, time is open. Time admits there's more possibilities. There's something else could happen here. Let's be more committed to time than we are to freezing things and passing judgment. Time is more important than space. I think that's a wonderful principle for him. And he's very adamant about that. And the other core principle he has is reality is more important than ideas. He said, deal with the reality. But understand, we are all works in progress. We are on the way. So if someone says, I've made a decision in my sexual life that this is what's right for me, I can have a good conversation with them, Joanne, and not at church on Sunday saying, hey, guess what, everybody? Pope Francis, there's a wonderful story about him in Rome. Somebody in Rome was hitting people over the head with a lead pipe, tourists, and then robbing them. Pope Francis said, why don't they put a little cloth on there? Because they were really damaged. They had really bad head injuries. He said, if only they just put a cloth on the pipe. They wouldn't end up in the hospital. Headline next day, Pope says okay to hit people with a lead pipe as long as you rapidly fly. That's not the point. The point is not to pronounce things, it's to accompany people. He meant that if somebody came to somebody and said, I'm the guy who's hitting people with a lead pipe, but I can't stop because I got to feed my family, you might say to them, well, put a piece of cloth on it, for crying out loud. That might be where it shows up, not in the pulpit. But our culture wants it to be absolute. We're addicted to space. We want to freeze it and make a law about it. And he said, no, don't do it. He said, accompany people, integrate people, put them on the journey, let it unfold. Is that a little bit helpful for you? He said, one of his quotes is, pastors cannot apply law as if they're throwing stones at people. You should not be here. There should be filled with priests. I should be telling this to priests, not to you people, but I'm glad you're hearing it. He likens the church, he says, to a mother who clearly expresses to her children what is right, yet does what she can, even if she gets mud on her shoes. I like that image. Clearly expresses what is right, but allows them to do what they can, even if she gets mud on her shoes. So I think those are really helpful images for us. Another one of his lines is, you cannot control every experience a child has. You can just accompany them, help them to process what happens, make a good decision, make the best decision they can, commit yourself to loving them and to staying with them and to accompanying them so they can make a new decision next year, and maybe it'll be a better decision. I think that's really helpful. The last thing we might want to touch on here a little bit is conflict. So Pope Francis is has written a bunch on conflict, and partly because you can see if you take those models of the church, the city behind the walls. That was our model of conflict, right? We're not going to let you in here, and we're going to keep you away, keep you outside. So the church avoided conflict, and she avoided conflict by making pronouncements. That's wrong. That's how she avoided it. Pope Francis says conflicts are really good. Now, having been through a few conflicts in my life, I'm not sure I really agree with him absolutely about that, but he's really clear about that. And when you think about it, he has some wonderful insights, because he says, in conflict you discover who you are. In conflict you discover what your real values are. In conflict you discover what's really important in a culture. What are the rights in this culture? There are no human rights that have ever been realized without conflict. And when you think about it, that's absolutely true. The only way people ever came to understand that there's a right to free speech or a right to this was through conflict. It did not come easily. But he says, how are we to understand conflict? Because he says, when you're having this conflict, and whether having a conflict with Joanne, how do I picture Joanne? Do I see her as an enemy? Do I see her as a stranger? How do I picture her? Because if I see her as an enemy or a combatant, then my goal is I've got to defeat her. But if I see her as a stranger, then part of this, I've got to get to know Joanne. I've got to get to know, why is Joanne asking this question? Why is that a concern to her? I've got to get to know her and turn this into a genuine encounter. And Pope Francis, if he's about anything, he's about encounter. Dialogue, 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 encounter, encounter, encounter. Because he says conflict is necessary if we are to reach the truth. And he said it's not about compromise, it's about having enough conversation back and forth so eventually, he says, you can get to a higher truth. You get to a new truth that's here, a better truth. Not just trade-offs. He's not a trade-off person. Enough conversation so eventually the Spirit will lead us to a deeper truth, a more important truth up here. I think that's really quite wonderful, you know? Refreshing to be able to think about conflict as something necessary, something we have to learn how to do, something that produces, helps to reveal values, helps to build character. I think it's healthy to hear people speak about conflict as a good thing. Because I was brought up with, don't fight with your brother, you know, that sort of stuff. So we were taught as we were kids, conflict was a bad thing. But here's our Pope telling us, no, conflict is a good thing. It helps us to realize it. The other thing that he points out is the public forum has a right to shine a flashlight on the church from their point of view, and we have an obligation to answer. No, I think we've had an attitude towards the press, to the world that says, bug off. Get your nose out of our business. This is our business. No, he says the public has a right to shine a flashlight on the church from their point of view, and we have an obligation to look at ourselves from their point of view and give an answer. I think some of that stuff is just really refreshing. I think it's just... we're moving on here. We'll just finish with a couple of those things at the bottom on... what's the
How do you defend the faith without raising your voice?
Without raising your voice. After I've just hollered at you for I thought they're really kind of interesting, those last things in there, because the first one was reframe the conversation. I thought that was such an interesting thing because, you know, when you think about it, Jesus is always doing that in the Gospels. And he does it so effectively. You know, the disciples are having a conversation about which of them is the most important. What does Jesus do? He picks up a child and puts the child in the middle of them. All of a sudden, the conversation is reframed, you know. They get mad at his disciples because they were picking grain on the Sabbath. Jesus says, is it lawful to pull your donkey out of the ditch on the Sabbath? Reframes the conversation. I thought that was really good. I thought that was such good advice because when we start a fight, immediately we're like this. We're hammering away at it. Reframe the conversation. And then he talks about how there's always something good. Everybody has something good to say and to add to the conversation. You have to find out what is it. What's the good thing that we're talking about in here? It might be the value of human life. It might be the value of speech. It might be the importance of the community, whatever it is. But everybody there's a value, a good value in both opinions that are being expressed here. You have to find out what are the good values that everybody is talking about in here. One of the things he talks about, he says, make sure you're always saying yes. There's something in here that needs to be affirmed. People need to hear that they have hold of something that's really good. They should hear a yes. And he said, and they should always know that they have been loved. He says, that's when you have a really good conversation. You never have a good conversation like this. We don't. I know. I'm really bad at it. I'm Irish. It's my problem. So I have lots to learn from Pope Francis, and I very much appreciated some of those insights. We've talked for a long time here, and I'm sorry for that. But is that a little bit helpful on that thing? You get a little refreshing sense that he really is opening some doors and letting some air kind of flow through the church and allowing us to a little bit of freedom to think maybe and to accompany people and to not have things cast in steel. One of the things he acknowledges that people wished he would forbid more things. That's one of his criticisms. You're not forbidding enough stuff. He says, what is that? He said, what is that? We don't need to forbid things. We need to accompany people, listen to people, allow them to make a choice, accompany them some more, love them some more, allow them to make another choice. I mean, I just think the things you know, and most of you know this because you're parents, you know that about your children. It's very refreshing to have the church finally to agree and to say, yes, what you have been doing with your children as you've watched them grow and make new decisions and accompany them on the journey, the church is finally saying that to us. Learn to accompany, learn to walk, learn to listen, and make new choices. Speaking of listening, I'll just give you a little background. So we have a Canadian cardinal, Cardinal Cherney, and one of the things he did as part of the synod is he conducted it's called Doing Theology on the Periphery. So he assembled a team of people in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and their goal was to go out to the peripheries, to the margins, and invite conversations with people about how they saw their faith and how they saw the church. And they published these in several big documents. So today in the gospel and the first reading, we hear all of the storms, trumpets, things falling from the heavens, different voices. So the homily today is just going to be listening to these voices from South America. Okay? Jim and Helen, well, they're going to talk at the mic. I gave sheets to some of you. No, you just stay where you are. But what I'm going to suggest we do during the homily is just close your eyes. Don't think about who the speaker is. Listen. Listen to the voice. Listen to what that voice from South America is saying. And see if after we've had this experience, it changes your perspective. It changes what's important to you. It changes what you value and what you take into consideration. But instead of looking at Jim or Mary when she sits down, just close your eyes during the homily. I'm just going to read the gospel and sit down, and then they're numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we'll just listen to these voices, and then we'll have the prayers of the faithful. How does that sound? We're okay with that? Yeah. You're very patient. Thank you very much.